We have been living with COVID-19 for the better part of 2020. The virus has infected millions, killed hundreds of thousands, and has upended the lives of people around the world. We all want to know, when will this end? For many, hopes for a return to normal are tied to a vaccine, and impressive strides have been made in the search for one.
A vaccine could be the key to reopening the country, and it's why officials at the White House are doing anything they can to fast forward the process. Operation Warp Speed. The White House's race to find a coronavirus vaccine has just tapped 2 new leaders to oversee the operation.
This morning, there's renewed optimism in the search for a coronavirus cure. Moderna's vaccine test is showing promise.
The first COVID-19 vaccine trial in South Texas is now underway.
But what does the search for a vaccine entail? How long will it be until one of these clinical trials is successful? And even when there is a vaccine, will that be the ultimate COVID solution?
KSAT explains.
KSAT explains. KSAT explains.
KSAT explains. On demand, in-depth perspective.
Perspective on stories we bring you in our newscasts throughout the day.
We're looking into concerns over voting safety during a pandemic and the battle over mail-in voting. A look at how the protests and demonstrations have played out in our city and an examination of what it means to be black in San Antonio.
An issue that you have likely felt the effects of, rising property taxes.
The roots of Tejano run deep in South Texas. We examine the cultural impact the music has had in San Antonio.
This week's episode will focus on the search for a COVID-19 vaccine.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of KSAT Explains. I'm Myra Arthur. This week, COVID-19 is dominating our show once again, but this time we're focusing on the search for a solution, an answer to the question we are all asking: when will life return to normal? A lot of people believe the answer to that is when there's a vaccine. Truth is, it may be more complicated than that, which we will get to. But first, let's take a step back and explain where vaccines come from and how they work.
It's something people have known for centuries. Some diseases never infect the same person twice thanks to immunity. Artificial immunity is the idea behind vaccines, and people have been trying to achieve it for hundreds of years. Some historians believe the Chinese inoculated themselves against smallpox as early as the year 1000 AD. But the founder of immunology in the West is considered to be Edward Jenner. In 1796, Jenner took pus from a cowpox sore on a milkmaid's hand and deliberately infected a young boy with it. Months later, he exposed the boy a number of times to smallpox, but the boy had developed an immunity and never got smallpox. Jenner's early methods went through medical changes over decades, but ultimately led to the elimination of smallpox in 1979. Louis Pasteur became the next major figure in the prevention of diseases and immunology. In 1885, Pasteur and Pierre Roux developed a rabies vaccine from infected rabbits. Pasteur also spearheaded the early stages of a cholera vaccine that was developed and used by a Spanish physician that year. He also started work on an anthrax vaccine during the early 1880s. A vaccine for plague was also invented in the late 19th century.
The early 1930s was a significant time for vaccines, bringing about immunizations for diphtheria, typhoid, tetanus, tuberculosis, and whooping cough. And for the first time, vaccines were introduced for influenza and yellow fever from 1937 to 1939.
Medical advancements throughout the 20th century have led to the creation of even more. American scientists William Hammond and Jonas Salk were responsible for the polio vaccine in 1952. From the 60s to 70s, we saw vaccines created for measles, mumps, chickenpox, and pneumonia. In the past 10 years alone, we have already seen vaccines created for malaria, dengue fever, and Ebola. Several diseases have been eliminated through the use of vaccines. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention calls them one of the greatest success stories in public health.
That's a rundown of how vaccines have evolved throughout history. Now RJ breaks down how they work.
The simplest explanation for how a vaccine works is that it helps the human body develop immunity to a disease by imitating an infection. Once a vaccine is introduced, it starts working with the body's natural defenses.
Either receiving it via an injection or nasally or by mouth, and creating an immune response within your own body.
Using the same germs that cause disease, vaccines cause the human body's immune system to produce T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, which produce antibodies. These defensive white blood cells help fight infection, and they train the body to remember how to fight that disease in the future.
That virus or bacteria enter inside, that it will help and fight off that infection so that you don't succumb to those symptoms associated with that infection.
There are 5 main types of vaccines young children commonly get in the US. Some introduce a weaker form of the virus into the body that will not spread or make a child sick. An inactivated vaccine is made of dead germs or cells. Even though these vaccines aren't live, they still teach immune systems how to fight the live virus. Toxoid vaccines prevent diseases caused by bacteria that produce poisons or toxins in the body.
Many of us get these vaccines as kids, but then later have to get them as teenagers and adults. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says there are 4 reasons why.
Some vaccines, primarily inactivated, do not provide complete immunity, so more than 1 dose is needed. Another reason, with some vaccines, immunity begins to wear off over time. At that point, a booster dose is needed to bring immunity levels back up.
You can receive them again, and you can receive multiple in time in order to get that appropriate response once again to protect your immune system.
Some vaccines may need more than 1 dose to provide the right amount of antibodies to fight off an infection. And finally, an annual flu vaccine is needed because the flu may be different from season to season. Vaccines, like any medication, can cause side effects, but the CDC says most are mild. Even with advances in healthcare, the diseases that vaccines prevent can still be very serious.
So when will we have a vaccine for COVID-19? We all want to know the answer to that question. And while the novel coronavirus vaccine is on track to be the fastest ever produced, if history is any indication, it could still take a while. The federal government has set a goal to deliver 300 million doses of a safe COVID-19 vaccine by January 2021. That may seem like a long time for those tired of the mask wearing and the social distancing, but it would actually be the fastest vaccine ever produced by far. It took years of research before the first influenza vaccine was approved for civilian use in 1945, and the polio vaccine took decades to produce. According to historyofvaccines.org, the first major documented polio outbreak in the U.S. was in 1894. But it took about 60 years before the first successful polio vaccines were distributed. To date, the mumps vaccine is the fastest ever produced. It was approved in 4 years. So why does it take so long to develop vaccines? There are a lot of reasons, including clinical trials, which are conducted to make sure vaccines are effective and won't cause harm. Historically, there's also been another hurdle, a lack of resources.
We start making vaccines, there's great scientists around the world that lean in, but ultimately it costs a lot of money.
Sometimes, because of a lack of will and resources, work will begin on a vaccine and then stall and remain unfinished. That's what happened with a SARS-CoV-1 vaccine that was in the pipeline. Scientists believe if that vaccine was finished and existed today, they would have an advantage in the search for a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19.
And since this pandemic is due to let's say a cousin of the first SARS outbreak, maybe we would have been ahead of the game if we actually had a FDA-approved vaccine for SARS and could use that as a platform to launch a vaccine against this new virus.
There are more than 165 COVID-19 vaccine trials underway, according to the New York Times. The Times is tracking all of the trials all around the world. Take a look at their coronavirus vaccine tracker. It's broken up by phases: preclinical, phase 1, 2, 3, and approval. 6 have made it to phase 3. And a lot of that research is happening right here in San Antonio. Clinical Trials of Texas in the medical center area is in charge of 4 COVID-19 vaccine trials. 2 of them, Moderna and Pfizer, are currently underway. According to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, vaccine trials go through 3 phases before final FDA approval. Phase 1 is small. It can last several months. Normally, about 20 to 100 people participate. Volunteers have to qualify, and they undergo a strict screening process.
They will have a medical history taken and a medication history. They will see a physician It'll be determined whether or not they actually qualify for this study.
During phase 1, researchers test the drug's safety, determine a safe dosage, and identify side effects. Phase 2, the vaccine is given to a much larger group, usually several hundred people. It provides additional safety data. It also allows researchers to see how the volunteers' immune systems are responding to the vaccine. Phase 2 can last several months to 2 years. Phase 3 can include several hundred to thousands of participants. About 30,000 volunteers are expected to enroll in the Moderna study across 89 clinical research sites in the U.S., including here in San Antonio. People are normally placed into 2 groups. One group gets the vaccine, the other doesn't.
They're not going to know which one they get, nor will we. So everything is what we call in the clinical research industry, it's called blinded. And that keeps us very honest.
During phase 3, the results are more likely to show long-term or rare side effects. That's because the length of study can be 1 to 4 years. Moderna is currently in phase 3. Human trials began in March. Moderna's research so far has produced encouraging results. In the first phase, there were 45 participants, ages 18 to 55 years. They received 2 injections 28 days apart. More than half the participants reported fatigue, headache, chills, muscle aches, or pain at the injection site. Researchers say after the second shot, it generated neutralizing antibodies. The Pfizer trial is in phase 2-3. That means they're conducting both phases 2 and 3 at the same time. Up to 30,000 participants age 18 to 85 years are expected across 120 sites globally. Dr. Stephen Davis of San Antonio is one of those participants.
I can't think of a more important clinical trial to participate in than this one, since this is the biggest health threat of my life.
Pfizer reported similar findings. You've probably noticed that the race to find a COVID-19 vaccine has been a fast one. That's because the federal government has sped up the process. It's been dubbed Operation Warp Speed.
That data, I'm sure, is being compiled and sent forward to the FDA so that everybody can look at the data now in real time and really do it as quickly as possible, so that decisions can be made whether or not to approve this vaccine and make it available for our population to receive, hopefully early next year.
So why San Antonio? What makes our city so well positioned to host these critically important trials? We talked to 2 people who know best, who say San Antonio has traits that are key to helping find the COVID solution we're all hoping for.
Unfortunately, a lot of people see San Antonio as kind of a small place in the life science community.
But Heather Hansen is working to change that. She's the president of Biomed SA, the nonprofit dedicated to growing and promoting the life sciences in San Antonio.
We have such a strong research community as well as a top-notch hospital community, and we also have military medicine. And in addition to all of that, we have our entrepreneurial space and our industry. So we actually have a lot more components to the life science industry than most communities.
One of those research resources is Texas Biomedical Research Institute.
Vaccines are really the end-all in terms of eradicating infectious disease.
Dr. Larry Schlesinger is Texas Biomed president and CEO.
A second reason why San Antonio is so good, in my opinion, is that fundamentally, this is a unique community because it's very civic-minded. I mean, people want to participate because they understand the good that will come from a vaccine that makes it to the market.
It's also the makeup of the people of San Antonio that makes our city so valuable in these clinical trials. Vaccines must be tested on a variety of people who have a variety of health conditions, and that includes health complications called comorbidities, things like obesity, diabetes, and hypertension.
You know, our community unfortunately has all of that represented. It has been called a city of the future because it actually is a melting pot for cultural diversity and healthcare disparities, a diverse population that we really need to focus on. So I think that we have a demographic in the city that also is very helpful in enrolling patients into these very large clinical studies.
Last year, there were more than 1,400 clinical studies happening in San Antonio. Hansen says another reason we're a good choice for that work, plainly put, It's because we're nice.
But companies really do look to collaborate with each other, to help each other. Executives routinely call other executives at companies or healthcare organizations here and ask for advice or help, share resources, go together for grant opportunities. So we really do work together here and help each other, which is very unique for our industry.
The path to a vaccine is not an easy one, but for a lot of people, it's viewed as a potential light at the end of what's been a very long tunnel. So this next reality may not be welcome news. A vaccine passing clinical trials and gaining approval will then present a whole new set of challenges. Once a safe and effective vaccine is created, there will be a series of big questions that need answers. Among the first, how quickly can it be produced?
That requires that we have a manufacturing process, that we have facilities.
The federal government is already preparing for this challenge by investing hundreds of millions in expanding vaccine manufacturing capacity. Still, with an obviously monumental demand, manufacturing issues could cause delays in getting a vaccine to everyone who wants one.
And it may require 2 or 3 doses in a given individual. Well, there are 7.4 billion people on the planet. So how many doses do we really need? And then how do we prioritize?
That's the next hurdle. Who will be first in line for the new vaccine? Here in the U.S., a committee of experts has been tapped to draft guidance on how to distribute initial doses. That guidance is expected to be released at the end of September and is expected to be controversial. Traditionally, first in line for new vaccines are healthcare workers and the most vulnerable. But the Associated Press reports things like geography are being looked at. There's a possibility people who live in areas considered hotspots could be prioritized. And because of the disproportionate effect COVID-19 has had on Latinx and Black populations, health officials have also discussed whether race and ethnicity should be considered. And while some will anxiously wait in line for a chance to get immunized, there are others who may not want the vaccine. Some are skeptical because the creation of this COVID vaccine has been fast-tracked. But experts say just because the process has been quicker than usual doesn't mean important safety steps have been skipped.
Fast tracking means that you not necessarily are just trying to push this forward and move forward in such a fast manner, but that you're having more people work on it and you're having them collaborate together so that they can figure this out sooner. So it's like building a house. If you only have a couple of people building a house, it's going to take a long time. But if you get tons of people together and build that house, it's going to build rather quickly. And if you get the right people, they're going to build it very well.
But some may not trust the new vaccine, in part because the pandemic has been made so political.
There is a lot of political interface going on with our vaccines, more than I've ever seen before. And I think this is trouble for us because it creates confusion in the public sector about whether safety exists.
A recent CBS News poll shows only 30% of respondents would get a coronavirus vaccine as soon as possible if one was available. The other 70% said they would either wait to see what happens or would never get one. And a large percentage of the population needs to get vaccinated to establish what's known as herd immunity. So what does it take to achieve herd immunity? It varies depending on the disease. But UT's MD Anderson Center estimates that for this particular coronavirus, 60 to 70% of the human population would need to have antibodies.
What's really important is that a community joins together. Everybody that is capable of getting vaccinated gets vaccinated so that they can protect those that may have a weaker immune system or have other complicating factors that makes them at higher risk.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of KSAT Explains. Before we go, we want to share with you a snippet of my conversation with Texas Biomed President and CEO, Dr. Larry Schlesinger. During our conversation, he said that he hopes we're all able to learn from this extraordinary health crisis we're living through. Because while pandemics don't happen often, he says this will not be the last one. Dr. Schlesinger believes part of the problem with this pandemic response has been that it's been reactive instead of proactive. He hopes next time that changes.
We are aiming ourselves to a new day. And that new day is to be much more proactive in the way we think about new diagnostics, therapies, and vaccines. We have our eye on ensuring that we make discoveries and complete these types of important clinical challenges before epidemics and pandemics occur. That has to be the answer.
How do you do that? Because we have talked about this being a novel virus. It's one that we didn't know much about before it hit. So how are you proactive and work to prevent the spread of something that we may not have seen before?
What we're learning about in this reactive mode is the importance of public-private partnerships, the important role that government plays, the important role that research institutes like Texas Biomed, foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, academic health centers like UT Health San Antonio and others, we all have a role to play. And what we need to do is optimize on an ongoing basis those relationships, not just in response to a pandemic, but an ongoing relationship that puts us in a better position to pivot and to more quickly come in for the next challenge, rather than need to assemble these partnerships in response to a pandemic.